Just a nurse who doesn't know her place. That's what Dr. Caldwell had said to the previous night shift supervisor, loud enough for the whole ER to hear. Sarah Chen hadn't been there that night, but word traveled fast through the break room at Seattle General. She'd filed the comment away the same way she filed everything else, carefully, without reaction, the way you catalog intelligence in a war zone. You listen. You remember. You survive. The thing Dr. Caldwell didn't know was that Sarah had spent 14 years listening. She'd listened in Ramadi while coordinating trauma teams under fire. She'd listened in field hospitals where the sound of incoming mortars meant incoming casualties. She'd listened to the silence that came after she'd disobeyed a direct order to save 3 civilian children and the green beret lying in the rubble beside them, the one now assigned to room 347, the one she hadn't seen in 4 years. The fluorescent lights at Seattle General hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Sarah pushed the medication cart down the corridor at 2,200 hours. The night shift stretched ahead like a familiar road, predictable, quiet, safe in its anonymity. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the first vial from the 4-pump station. Just the shrapnel speaking, the way it always did when she was tired. The piece of metal from a roadside bomb in Fallujah had settled near a nerve cluster in her forearm, and some nights it reminded her it was still there. She steadied the tremor by curling her fingers inward, a gesture so practiced it had become invisible to everyone around her. The movement looked like a habit. It was actually muscle memory from field surgery, where a steady hand meant the difference between a patient coded and a patient saved. She moved through the medication preparation with unusual speed, her fingers dancing across vial labels and dosage schedules with the precision of someone who'd spent years memorizing pharmaceutical nomenclature not from textbooks but from necessity. The hospital pharmacy had no idea she could cross-reference controlled substances in her sleep, that she'd managed medication distribution for a surgical unit in a combat zone where 1 decimal point error meant someone's child didn't come home. Here at Seattle General, she was simply the quiet night shift nurse who kept to herself, who never complained, who filed her charts correctly and left her station cleaner than she found it. The invisibility suited her. She'd learned in Ramadi that the loudest people in the room were usually the first to get noticed, and being noticed was something Sarah Chen could no longer afford. The inventory flagged a discrepancy in room 201's morphine stock around midnight. Sarah pulled the delivery manifest and cross-referenced it against the actual vial count. 3 vials present. Lot numbers didn't match. The pharmaceutical delivery sheet listed batch code for 47829A, dated 3 weeks prior. The vials in stock read for 47829C, dated 2 weeks prior. She made a mental note to flag it with the pharmacy supervisor in the morning, then filed the observation away with all the other small things she noticed but never discussed. The medication cart squeaked slightly as she rolled it to the next station, the sound cutting through the mostly quiet ER. Only 3 trauma bays occupied tonight. The city of Houston seemed to be cooperating with the graveyard shift, which meant it might actually be possible to take a break sometime before dawn. At 0247 hours, a man came in through the ER doors with his daughter. He was in his 60s, graying at the temples, military bearing visible even as the paramedics wheeled him toward the cardiac unit. His daughter followed, uniformed herself, navy blues with the insignia of a lieutenant colonel. Sarah caught the briefing as she passed: acute chest pain, left arm numbness, EKG shows T-wave inversion in leads 2 and 3, possible anterior wall MI, arrived at 0245, currently stable but symptomatic. The paramedics had him on supplemental oxygen, for access established, nitroglycerine administered. Room 347. The observation isolation room with the best equipment. Sarah had prepped it an hour earlier, restocking the crash cart, checking the defibrillator pads, making sure the ventilator was functioning properly. She'd run through the mental checklist the way she always did, methodically, thoroughly, the way combat training had taught her to do everything. She didn't look at the patient's face as the team transferred him from the paramedic stretcher to the hospital bed. She focused on the logistics. Cardiac monitor leads. Oxygen saturation probe. Blood pressure cuff around his right arm, positioned properly to avoid any obstruction. His daughter held the chart, reading it with the focus of someone accustomed to reading equipment manifests and casualty reports. The woman had seen field operations. You could tell by the way she moved through a crisis, economical and precise, no wasted motion. Major Chen. The voice came from across the room. Sarah froze for exactly half a second, the kind of freeze that was invisible to most people, just a slight pause in her movement, a breath not taken. Then she turned, her face arranged in the expression she'd perfected over 2 years at Seattle General, neutral, deferential, ready to serve. It wasn't the patient speaking. It was the daughter, the lieutenant colonel, and her eyes had gone wide with recognition. Sarah's mind flashed to a file photo, 14 years old, from a military database she'd accessed exactly once in the months after Ramadi, when she was still angry enough to research the people who destroyed her career. The file listed a general, a daughter who'd followed the family tradition into uniform. The general's only child. The one who'd testified in the court-martial hearing, the one who'd believed her father's version of the story, not Sarah's. Just a nurse, Sarah said quietly, turning back to the monitor display. Can I get you anything, Em? Coffee? Water? The daughter opened her mouth to speak again, but the general stirred slightly on the bed, his hand reaching upward. Water, he rasped. Throat's dry. Sarah moved without hesitation, working with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Ice chips in a cup. Flexible straw. She held it where he could reach without straining his cardiac system, kept her face neutral when his eyes found hers, when she saw the moment of confusion cross his features. For years had passed. He'd aged, the stress of command etching deeper lines around his mouth and eyes. She wondered if he'd aged in other ways too, if he'd replayed Ramadi the way she had, if he'd ever questioned whether he'd made the right call when he'd ordered her arrest. Thank you, he said, his voice hoarse from the dry throat. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. Just a night shift nurse, someone beneath notice, someone whose face he'd never bothered to learn because she'd been military then, a major in uniform, not a civilian woman in blue scrubs. By 0400 hours, the general had stabilized. His EKG was showing less T-wave inversion. His troponin levels were elevated but not catastrophically so. Acute coronary syndrome, not a full MI. He'd be going to the cardiac unit for observation and stress testing, but he wasn't dying tonight. His daughter had curled up in the visitor's chair, her uniform jacket draped over the armrest, finally allowing herself to rest now that the immediate crisis had passed. Sarah checked his vitals one more time, her hands steady as surgical instruments, her breathing controlled, the kind of control that only came from having stood in a field hospital while mortars landed close enough to shake the walls. At 0530 hours, Sarah stopped in the supply room to restock her crash cart supplies. She moved methodically through the rows of syringes, bandages, and medication vials, her mind already cataloguing what would need to be replaced by the day shift. That's when she noticed Dr. Caldwell through the gap in the supply room door, near the medication storage cabinet at the far end of the corridor. He was alone. His back was to her. His hand was moving a vial from one shelf to another, swapping it quickly with something from his coat pocket. The movement was practiced, smooth, the kind of motion that only came from repetition. Sarah kept walking. She didn't pause. She didn't watch. She simply observed and filed the information away like every other piece of intelligence she'd collected over 2 years at Seattle General. The vial he'd swapped was morphine. The lot number, from her vantage point, matched the discrepancy she'd flagged in the inventory system. She pulled her supplies from the shelf opposite the medication cabinet, took her time, let her hands do the work while her mind processed the implications. Dr. Caldwell was on the hospital board for controlled substance distribution. He had access to the pharmacy protocols. He had clearance for inventory adjustments. And he was apparently making inventory adjustments that didn't match the paperwork. She turned and walked back toward the ER without ever making eye contact. Behind her, she heard the soft click of the cabinet door closing. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical prayer. A code blue alert sounded 3 floors up. Someone's heart had decided to stop working, and somewhere in this hospital, someone was going to have to decide whether to save them or let them go. Sarah returned to her station and clocked out at 0600 hours, the end of her shift, the beginning of another day where she would pretend to be someone she wasn't. She touched the dog tag in her pocket as she passed through the ER doors. The metal was cool against her palm, worn smooth from years of being carried in a combat pocket for more years of being carried in a scrub pocket. The broken chain had never been repaired. She'd never bothered to have it fixed because the break itself felt honest somehow, a reminder that some things, once broken, couldn't be put back together the way they were before. The rain outside had just started, a light drizzle that fell on Houston like an afterthought. Sarah walked through it without raising her collar, without hurrying. The hospital would be switching shifts now, day staff arriving, night staff departing. Dr. Caldwell would file his reports. The general would wake up in the cardiac unit, wondering who the quiet nurse was who'd known exactly how to make him comfortable. His daughter would ask for her name, and someone would tell her, and it would mean nothing to them because Sarah Chen was nobody. Just a nurse. Just a woman with a trembling left hand and a broken chain around a dog tag she'd never explained to anyone. What none of them knew was that she'd already read the medication discrepancies. She'd already seen what Dr. Caldwell was doing. She'd already made the choice not to speak about it, the way she always made choices, carefully, alone, carrying the weight of information that could destroy a man's career without anyone ever knowing she'd been the one holding it. She walked into room 347 at 2,247 hours with the general's chart in her hands, her documentation precise and clinical, arrhythmia pattern emerging every 4 to 6 minutes, slight elevation in troponin levels, cardiac output trending downward. The morning shift vitals had shown stability. Now, at 2,300 hours, something was changing. Something was wrong. The general's daughter stood by the window in civilian clothes, jeans and a grey sweater, her posture military even in stillness, her eyes tracking every monitor the way someone trained to read threat assessment reads a room. She hadn't introduced herself. Sarah hadn't asked. The chart had listed next of kin as LTCM Chen, but the woman's eyes when she'd glanced at Sarah's name badge had flickered with something Sarah couldn't read. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 2,304 hours. He didn't knock. He didn't greet the patient. He snatched the chart from Sarah's hands mid-notation, his fingers brushing against hers with deliberate coldness, the movement sharp enough that both the general and his daughter looked up from whatever silent conversation their glances had been holding. Caldwell's voice came out velvet-wrapped razors. "Did I ask for your medical opinion, Nightingale? You take vitals and empty bedpans. The actual thinking is my job." The chart pages crinkled under his grip. Two residents frozen in the hallway door processed the humiliation in real time, their coffee cups suspended halfway to their mouths. Sarah felt the words land like shrapnel, precise, calculated, designed to detonate in front of witnesses. Her left hand trembled for exactly 1/10 of a second before she locked it against her thigh. Not from fear. From the effort of not moving. One measured breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way she'd learned to breathe during the cardiac assessment of a 9-year-old in Ramadi whose parents were screaming in Arabic and whose heart was failing because of a piece of shrapnel the size of a thumbnail. Focus on the patient. Ignore everything else. A single tear formed at the corner of her right eye. She let it come, observed it the way a sniper observes wind speed, and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. Her voice when she spoke was devastatingly calm, each word a separate sentence. "I documented an arrhythmia pattern. ST segment elevation on the monitor strip. The patient's care requires it." Caldwell's face didn't redden. It did something worse, it went pale with the fury of a man realizing his humiliation tactic hadn't worked. The residents exchanged glances. The general's daughter's jaw tightened slightly. Caldwell's response came from somewhere deeper than irritation. "The patient's care requires you to know your place." He left before Sarah could respond, the chart tucked under his arm like a trophy, his scrubs whispering against the door frame. The general's daughter watched him go, then looked back at Sarah with an expression that felt like being X-rayed. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. "For documenting it." Sarah nodded once and returned to the monitor, her hand steady as surgical steel. 2 hours later, at 00 for 7 hours, Sarah entered the break room with her dinner in a paper bag from home, something she'd learned to do early in her tenure at Seattle General, a habit from military deployments where you never trusted the base kitchen. The night shift crew was arranged around the small table like a greeting card photograph, Martinez laughing at something Johnson had said, Williams scrolling through her phone, Chen number 2, a different Chen, no relation, pouring coffee into a mug that read World's Okayest Nurse. The laughter died when Sarah appeared in the doorway. Not slowly. Completely. She watched them register her presence the way a predator reads prey, the micro-expressions, the rapid calculation, the decision made without words. Martinez grabbed her mug and stood first, the scrape of her chair against tile sharp enough to cut. Johnson followed immediately, like a school of fish changing direction simultaneously. Williams didn't even look up, just rose and drifted toward the exit with the studied casualness of someone pretending they'd had somewhere else to be all along. Chen number 2 actually turned away from the coffee machine, abandoning her mug mid-pour, the liquid continuing to drip into the sink while she left. 30 seconds. That was the total duration of the break room emptying. 45 chairs worth of silence left behind. Sarah sat at the table where Caldwell had made his calculation that morning. The microwave beeped from 0100 hours, someone's food finished heating at some point, and nobody had retrieved it. She unwrapped her sandwich, turkey, Swiss, mustard. Smelled like home. Tasted like nothing. The sandwich was good. The silence was better. The silence was the point. The silence was Caldwell's signature, written in the absence of human contact, a message delivered by abandonment rather than words. She understood the grammar of it. She'd learned it in Ramadi when her decision to save 3 Iraqi children and a SEAL team member had cost her the trust of every officer in her chain of command except one, the general, lying upstairs in a hospital bed, his heart failing in real time. She'd learned it in the discharge reviews where the testimonies accumulated like snow, insubordinate, reckless, unreliable, willing to disobey direct orders. Nobody said she'd been right. Nobody said the children had lived. At 01 for 7 hours, Sarah discovered the public write-up posted on the unit board beside the schedule. Not in Caldwell's personal office. Not in a private email. On the board where every nurse, every tech, every resident rotating through Seattle General's night shift would see it. The handwriting was his, angular, aggressive, the pressure of the pen deep enough to have left indentations on the page underneath. Corrective actions, S. Chen, unauthorized treatment decisions. Overstepping scope of practice. Counseled regarding appropriate nurse behavior. Further violations will result in immediate suspension. 3-day shift nurses read it as they clocked in early, their voices dropping to the register reserved for discussing accident scenes. Sarah heard her last name drift down the corridor like smoke. She didn't turn around. Turning around was what Caldwell wanted, some visible sign of damage, a flinch that proved the strategy was working. She kept walking, her pace unchanged, her head level. By 0200 hours, Sarah noticed the reassignments. Her entire trauma team scattered like refugees, Martinez to the 3rd floor, Johnson to pediatrics, Williams transferred to urgent care. Her access credentials downgraded on the system so that when she needed to check the medication supply room inventory, something she'd done twice weekly since Caldwell's appearance there, a supervisor password was required. The message was written in logistics rather than words. You are isolated. You are watched. You are alone. At 0218 hours, Sarah documented the medication discrepancies to charge Nurse Williams, 2 vials of tamsulosin missing from the oncology cabinet between 2130 and 2200 hours, 2 different vials in the same location showing lot numbers partially obscured. The pattern repeated 3 times in the log. Williams literally turned her back mid-sentence. I don't have time for conspiracy theories from someone on corrective action, Chen. If Dr. Caldwell took something, it's because he had authorization. That's not your concern. The words landed soft and absolute. Not an argument. A closing of doors. Sarah paged Dr. Caldwell at 0225 regarding the general's deteriorating cardiac status, monitors showing increasing instability, ST segments flattening, output metrics declining. No response. She paged again at 0233. Voicemail message full. She called his cell at 0247, her heart rate elevated not from fear but from the mathematical equation of consequences. If the general coded under her watch, if she called it without Caldwell present, if she exceeded her scope as a nurse to save his life, it would be exactly what he documented on that board. Unauthorized treatment decisions. In room 347, the general's daughter was watching the monitors with the same intensity she'd trained on Sarah earlier. "Where's Dr. Caldwell?" she asked. Not accusatory. Just a question with tactical weight behind it. Responding to another emergency, Sarah said. It was the kind of lie that was technically true and completely false. "The monitors are showing some changes. I'm tracking them carefully." "You know how to read those?" It wasn't a question. Sarah met her eyes. "Held them?" "Yes." The dog tag arrived at 0251 hours. It fell from the general's belongings, the small pile of personal items the hospital had collected when he'd been admitted. A single dog tag on a broken silver chain, tarnished and old. It rolled off the edge of the bedside table and landed on Sarah's shoe with barely audible weight, a small sound like a lost shell casing. She picked it up. The name was partially worn away by years of deployment, but the series of numbers was clear. She recognized the format, 1950s vintage, military issue, the kind of dog tag that meant tours in places that no longer had names on maps. She pocketed it without thinking, muscle memory overriding protocol. In the field, you didn't leave equipment behind. In the field, you carried what mattered. In the field, you didn't ask permission. "That's his," the general's daughter said from across the room. She was still watching the monitors, but her attention had somehow shifted. It was like watching someone change radio frequencies mid-broadcast. From his first deployment. Sarah's fingers closed around the dog tag inside her pocket. The metal was warm from storage, still vibrating faintly with something that wasn't quite sound. She didn't remove her hand. "Thank you for telling me." "How did you know?" the woman asked. Not what, how. The question was precision-targeted. "In Ramadi." "How did you know the tamponade was developing if nobody had diagnosed it?" The room went still in the way rooms went still before anything moved. Before anything changed. Before everything became a before and an after divided by a single moment. Sarah's voice came out level. "I was trained to read the signs. Some patterns repeat themselves. Personnel file says you were a nurse." "Yes." "My father's personnel file says something different about what happened in Ramadi. Something about orders. Something about disobedience." The general's daughter stepped closer to the monitor, her shadow crossing Sarah's face. "Something about a major who refused to let him die." But that wasn't the worst part. At 0258 hours, Sarah paged Dr. Caldwell one final time regarding the general's declining output, and watched him appear in the hallway 30 seconds later, not moving toward room 347 but rather positioning himself where he could be clearly visible to the night supervisor. Deliberately visible. Making no move to intervene while the cardiac monitors told their story in real time. At 01 for 5 hours, Sarah moved through the medication records like she was reading a battlefield casualty report, each discrepancy a wound that didn't quite match the official story. 2 vials of fentanyl signed out by Dr. Caldwell at 2,200 hours. But the patient log showed the general received only a standard 50 microgram dose. The math didn't close. Never closed. She'd watched him do it twice in 2 weeks, the same careful swap, the same bland documentation, the kind of precision that came from practice. She approached the break room where 3 nurses clustered around a heating pad and lukewarm coffee. "Can I run something past you?" Sarah asked. The medication discrepancies in the surgical log from. The charge nurse looked at her shoes. The resident stared at her phone. The third nurse suddenly needed to check a patient down the hall. The silence was the answer. Sarah turned and left before anyone had to pretend they hadn't heard her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were singing a song only the guilty could hear. 23 years in medicine, 12 of them in combat, and she'd learned that people didn't want to know what they already suspected. The truth was heavier than the comfortable fiction, and most people were looking for someone to carry the weight for them. Not her job anymore. She'd given up command authority when she'd given up her rank, and speaking up without power was just noise in an empty hallway. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0200 hours, Sarah checked the general's cardiac monitor on her routine pass. His heart rate was climbing. 90. 100. 105. His blood pressure had drifted down by 6 points since the last check, nothing alarming in isolation, but the pattern was speaking to her in a language she understood. She pulled up his chart. O2 sat had dropped from 96 to 92 in the last 2 hours. His urine output was trending darker. Pericardial tamponade. Silent. Building. A balloon of fluid around his heart that was going to strangle him unless someone drained it, and the only person in this hospital who'd recognize it early enough was standing at a medication cart that everyone had learned to avoid. She checked his jugular veins. Slightly distended. She listened to his heart through her stethoscope, her ear pressed against the cold diaphragm like she was listening to a prisoner's last words. The heart sounds were muffled, distant, like they were calling from the bottom of a well. The general's eyes opened. He was awake, uncomfortable, his hand moving to his chest. Hard to breathe? Sarah asked. Pressure. Like someone sitting on my sternum. His voice was thin. Haven't felt this since, he didn't finish. Ramadi. The place where they'd both left pieces of themselves behind. Sarah adjusted his oxygen. I'm calling the doctor. She used the overhead intercom. Dr. Caldwell to room 347. General status change. 8 minutes. He took 8 minutes to walk in, and when he did, he moved like a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to prove. Sarah watched him glance at the monitor, at the general, at the monitor again. His mouth made a thin line. Continue the current management. We'll monitor, Caldwell said. His heart sounds are muffled. JVD is worsening. This is tamponade. Sarah's voice was level. Professional. Begging for nothing because she'd learned that begging was a waste of air. He needs immediate pericardiocentesis. Or what, Nurse Chen? You'll perform it yourself. Caldwell's smile was a knife wrapped in silk. The cardiothoracic team is en route. 30 minutes. We observe. He won't have 30 minutes. Sarah was aware of her hand on the monitor rail, aware that it wasn't trembling, it was steady, because her hands didn't shake anymore, they just did the work. Pressure's dropping. Rates climbing. He's compensating. That stops in. Step back from the patient, please. The word please was the only polite thing about it. It was an order wearing a question mark's clothing. Sarah stepped back, and Caldwell left, and the general's daughter gripped her father's hand in the doorway like she was trying to hold him to the earth with her fingers alone. At 0258 hours, the monitor alarm began its high-pitched scream. 3 steady beats. Then nothing. The screen went flat. The general's blood pressure collapsed, 70 over nothing, then 60. Then a number that barely qualified as alive. The general's daughter moved like she'd been waiting for this, like her body had been wound up and the mainspring had finally snapped. No. No, 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 no. Sarah hit the code button. The resident assigned to the general came running, a thin man named Marcus with hands that looked like they'd never held anything heavier than a pen. Sarah was already moving the crash cart. Compressions, she said. Now. He positioned himself over the general's chest and began, clumsy at first, then finding the rhythm, his shoulders dropping with each compression, his jaw clenched tight. A second resident appeared, and Sarah positioned them on the ambu bag. 20 compressions to 2 breaths. Count out loud. The monitor showed asystole. Flat line. No electrical activity. Just a dead heart and a body that was running out of oxygen 1 second at a time. Sarah's hand was steady as she reached for the 4 setup, steady as she found the antecubital vein, steady as she pushed medication that might as well have been prayers. 1 milligram epinephrine. Continue compressions, she said. Someone get me a thoracotomy kit. The second resident stared at her. Now, Sarah said. Not loud. Just quiet and final. The kit came. It arrived from the crash cart like it had been waiting, like every piece of equipment in this hospital had been holding its breath, waiting for the moment when civilian protocols became irrelevant and survival became the only law that mattered. Sarah cracked open the sterile field with movements that came from somewhere deeper than thought, from muscle memory coded into her bones in a tent hospital outside Fallujah, from 17 surgeries performed in conditions that made this spotless ER look like a palace. You need to wait for, the resident began. I've done this 17 times, Sarah said. Her voice sounded like someone else's. Colder. Sharper. Like it had been forged in a place where hesitation was a death sentence. Step back. Caldwell appeared in the doorway at 0305. He took in the scene, Sarah with her hands moving across the general's exposed chest cavity like a musician reading notes only she could see, the 2 residents staring like they'd wandered into a church and found a soldier praying at the altar, the general's daughter standing perfectly still with her hands at her sides. If you touch that patient, I will have your license before sunrise, Caldwell said. The words came out thin and careful, like he was reading a threat from a script. Sarah's supposedly trembling left hand, the one with the shrapnel scars, the one that had made her hide in night shifts for 2 years, found the pericardium and opened it with a surgeon's precision. The fluid released like a sigh. Dark blood, thick with clotting factors and the weight of pressure. She relieved the tamponade in 90 seconds, her fingers working the way fingers should work in a crisis, like they had access to knowledge her conscious mind wasn't aware it possessed. Like the woman she'd been before Ramadi, before the court-martial, before the medical discharge, before she'd learned to make herself small, had never actually left. Blood return was immediate. The monitor beeped once. Twice. 3 times in quick succession. Sinus rhythm. His blood pressure climbed. 70. 80. 90. His oxygen saturation rose from 54 to 71 to 88 to 95. The general's eyes opened. He wasn't dead anymore. He was just a man in shock, alive, breathing, held together by a woman whose hands had been forged for exactly this moment. The general's daughter made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a prayer, something between them that belonged to no language Sarah knew. Caldwell's face went white. Then red. Then the color drained from it entirely, leaving something calculatingly cold behind, something that looked at Sarah like she'd just become the most dangerous thing in this hospital. Security, he said, his voice never changing pitch. Remove this woman from my hospital. Now. Dr. Caldwell appeared 20 minutes later, moving through the ICU doors with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly what he would find. He took in the scene in one breath. The general stabilized on the monitor, O2 sat climbing steadily toward 96, the residents standing back with or still painted across their faces, and Sarah Chen, covered in blood that wasn't hers, holding a sanitized scalpel like it was a pen she'd just set down. His eyes went flat. Not the anger of a man witnessing a miracle. The calculation of a man watching a threat materialize in real time. He didn't say a word. He walked to the monitor, checked the readout, turned to the residents, and said quietly, "Clear the room." They hesitated. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command spoken in the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. The residents filed out. Sarah remained motionless, still in her bloody scrubs, the scalpel resting on the instrument tray. Caldwell met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In that moment, something shifted in the hospital's invisible hierarchy. He had come to see a complication to manage. He was leaving having identified a threat that needed elimination. By 03:30 hours, the phone calls had begun. Sarah heard them through the closed door of the ground floor conference room where security had deposited her like a problem to be warehoused. Caldwell's voice carried through the walls, calm and surgical in its precision. Yes, the board president should be aware, practicing medicine without a license, gross violation of scope of practice, resident witnesses to confirm. Yes, I understand the liability implications. Each call lasted for minutes. Each one was another brick in the wall. The hospital's director of human resources called back at 0340. Sarah heard Caldwell say, "I'm recommending immediate suspension, pending emergency hearing at dawn, her credentials suspended in the system as of now. I can have documentation ready within the hour." By 0345, her access badge had been flagged. She tried to understand the mechanics of how quickly a life could be dismantled, one successful procedure, one man's fear of exposure, and the entire architecture of her civilian existence began to crumble with bureaucratic efficiency. At 0350, two security guards arrived at the ICU with the kind of apologetic expressions people wear when they're about to do something they've been ordered to do. "We need you to come with us, Sarah." "Not Major." "Not Dr. Chen." "Sarah." The diminishment was already beginning. They escorted her from the patient floor, past nurses who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the resident she'd just taught how to save a life, down the elevator to the ground level where the night shift felt like a different hospital entirely. The laundry room. The locker room. Anywhere but the floors where doctors worked. "Your credentials have been suspended pending an administrative review," the HR representative said when she finally appeared at 0400, tablet in hand, words rehearsed. "There will be an emergency board hearing at 0900 hours. You're not to enter any patient care area until that hearing concludes. Those are the terms of your current suspension." Sarah nodded once. The woman continued, "You should contact legal representation immediately. Dr. Caldwell has filed a formal complaint of practicing medicine without a license, and we're obligated to." Sarah stopped listening. She understood the architecture now. Caldwell hadn't just called the board. He'd called the competing hospitals. She could piece that together from the timing. He'd built a narrative so airtight that by the time she walked into that hearing room, her reputation would already be cremated. The worst part wasn't the suspension. The worst part was the silence that followed. The night shift continued without her. The general remained stable upstairs. Caldwell moved through his shift like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just orchestrated her professional execution. She sat in the locker room at 0430, still in her bloody scrubs. She hadn't been allowed to change, hadn't been allowed to move, when the door opened and a woman in army dress uniform stepped through. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes. The general's daughter. Her face was tight with barely controlled fury. "His stable," Hayes said without preamble. "He's asking for you. He says you were there. In Ramadi." The words landed like shrapnel. Sarah's hands froze on her locker door. She didn't turn around. She could feel Hayes watching her, military eyes that missed nothing, that had been trained to identify threats and assets and people who were living lies. He said the nurse had a scar on her left hand. Shrapnel pattern. He said she moved like... Hayes paused. In that pause was the entirety of Sarah's hidden history. Like Major Chen. Sarah didn't answer. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she'd run out of lies 3 minutes into the emergency thoracotomy. Hayes stepped closer. "I served with your CO in Kandahar. He told me about the court-martial. He told me you saved people when you should have been protecting position. That the general spent for years fighting to get your record overturned." Still, Sarah said nothing. Her silence was a confession. Hayes nodded once, military to military, and said, "He's asking for you. When this is over, he wants you to know you were never alone in this. Not in Ramadi. Not tonight." The general's daughter left. Sarah was alone again, but the solitude felt different now. The past had stopped being something she could contain. It had walked through that door in an army uniform and shattered every compartment she'd built in the last 2 years. At 0600 hours, Sarah stood in the hospital laundry room for what she knew would be the lowest moment of her civilian life. The scrubs lay in a pile on the stainless steel table, the ones she'd worn for her night shifts, the ones that smelled of antiseptic and institutional hope. She began folding them with the same precision she'd used to perform the thoracotomy, each crease exact, each movement economical. Muscle memory from a life she'd thought she'd traded away. The fabric still carried the copper scent of the general's blood, the evidence of what she was capable of, the proof of everything she'd been trying to hide. She folded the last pair and placed them in the return bin. The laundry room hummed with the industrial rhythm of washers and dryers, the white noise of a hospital's invisible infrastructure, the machinery that cleaned away the evidence of trauma, the sounds that most people never heard because they didn't work in the places where healing happened in the dark. Sarah pressed her palms flat against the cool stainless steel and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to absorb the weight of what came next. Upstairs, Caldwell was assembling his presentation for the 0900 hearing. 8 pages of photographs documenting the unauthorized procedure. Witness statements from the residents, their descriptions already shaped by his framing, erratic behavior, unauthorized decision-making, dangerous vigilante mentality. A timeline of her concerning incidents going back 6 months. His case was flawless because he'd built it on truth, but truth could be weaponized like any other instrument if you knew how to hold it. By 0645 hours, every board member would receive a file marked urgent, personnel review. By 0730, the hospital's legal team would be conferencing with risk management. By 0900, Sarah Chen would be terminated with cause, her nursing license under investigation, her career burning down in a conference room while the man who'd actually saved a life, the general, lay upstairs in the ICU unable to defend her. The laundry room door closed behind her as she left. Somewhere above, a helicopter's rotors began to turn in the Houston pre-dawn darkness. At 0900 hours, the administrative conference room at Seattle General felt like a courtroom, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white, the long oak table separating board members from Dr. Caldwell like a judge's bench. He stood with practiced confidence, spreading laminated documents across the polished surface. Unauthorized treatment decisions. Scope of practice violation. Patient endangerment. Each word carefully chosen, each document perfectly organized. He'd spent the night preparing this presentation with the precision of a surgeon. The board president leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. Caldwell smiled. He had them. That was the moment the windows rattled. Not a gentle vibration. A deep, visceral shaking that made coffee cups slosh and the ceiling lights flicker. The sound followed, a thunderous percussion that could only mean one thing: helicopter rotors, multiple aircraft, moving closer. The board members froze. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Someone at the table whispered, "What is that?" The windows rattled again. Now the sound was unmistakable, the unmistakable whump-whump-whump of military-grade Black Hawks, the kind of sound that meant federal authority, that meant rank, that meant someone with clearance had just decided to land on top of a civilian hospital. The conference room door swung open without a knock. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes strode in wearing Class A dress blues, insignia gleaming, boots striking the tile with the kind of precision that made everyone sit up straighter. Behind her, 2 SEAL team operators in full tactical gear flanked the doorway, carbines slung, eyes scanning the room like they were clearing a hostile compound. The room went so quiet you could hear the helicopter rotors still turning on the roof, still turning, still present. Caldwell's face drained of color. He tried to speak. Nothing came. "You're discussing Major Sarah Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded warriors in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Silver Star recipient. Decorated officer. Someone you might want to know about before you continue. A nurse from the board, the same one who'd signed off on Sarah's suspension, reached for the sealed personnel file that had been locked in HR records for 3 years. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page made her breath catch, Bronze Star for Valor in Anbar Province. The second page, 2 purple hearts. A Purple Heart meant combat wounds. 2 of them meant Sarah Chen had bled for this country in ways Dr. Caldwell could never comprehend. The 3rd page was redacted in black ink, classified commendation from JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, the kind of authorization that meant Sarah's actions had been significant enough to require Pentagon-level secrecy. She was court-martialed, Caldwell said, his voice suddenly desperate, grasping for something, anything that might salvage his case. She violated direct orders. The SEAL operator on the left stepped forward. His name tape read, Mercer. His face was carved from granite, the kind of face that had seen things in Kandahar and Fallujah that didn't have names in English. "I'm Lieutenant Mercer, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon," he said. For years ago, Major Chen disobeyed a direct order in Ramadi, Jolin District. She left her post to perform a field amputation on me with a combat knife because my leg was going to bleed me out and the evacuation bird was still 37 minutes out. His voice remained steady, clinical, matter-of-fact. "That procedure saved my life. The same procedure also saved 3 Iraqi children who were hit in a crossfire. The general you have upstairs spent the last 4 years fighting the Pentagon to overturn her court-martial because she was right and he was wrong. Turns out that matters." Caldwell's hands gripped the table. His power was evaporating in real time, dissolving like smoke in the presence of federal authority, military rank, and the living testimony of warriors he couldn't intimidate. "I have a press conference scheduled," he said, and the words came out like desperation wrapped in arrogance. Channel 7 News. 10 o'clock. "I'm going to explain." "You're not going anywhere," Hayes said. "But you're welcome to try." The conference room was on the 4th floor. The press media room was in the basement, attached to the hospital's public relations office. Caldwell made his choice then, a choice born of panic and the belief that public narrative was still something he could control. He left the conference room, walked past the SEAL operators who didn't move to stop him, and headed downstairs. The elevator ride took 45 seconds. He used it to rehearse his opening statement, to picture himself on camera, to imagine the narrative shift that would come when millions of Houstonians heard his version of events before anyone else's. The media room smelled like stale coffee and the ozone tang of hot stage lights. A Channel 7 camera crew was already set, the morning broadcast just finished, the live press conference scheduled for 1,000 hours. Caldwell took position behind the podium. The producer gave him a thumbs up. Cameras rolled. The red light blinked on. Somewhere in Houston, in offices and cars and living rooms, people's phones began receiving news alerts, hospital administrator addresses concerns about dangerous nursing practice. "I'm Dr. Caldwell, Director of Emergency Medicine at Seattle General," he began. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years building a reputation. "I'm here to address a serious breach of medical protocol that endangered a patient's life. A nurse, acting without authority or qualification, performed a surgical procedure in violation of every standard of care, every protocol, every law governing the practice of medicine. This individual is not qualified to make life or death decisions, and she placed a patient at extraordinary risk through reckless." His phone rang. He ignored it. The producer had briefed him on this. Sometimes relatives called during live broadcasts, sometimes cranks tried to disrupt. "You ignored it and kept talking." The phone rang again. "Through reckless disregard for proper medical hierarchy. I'm here to protect patient safety, and this individual represents a threat to every patient in this hospital." The phone rang a 3rd time. The producer's hand moved to cut the feed, but before he could, a voice came through the open speaker phone, patched directly into the broadcast, a voice that bypassed every protocol and reached Houston live. "Dr. Caldwell. This is General James Ryder." Caldwell's words died. The camera captured every frame, the way his pupils dilated, the way his grip on the podium whitened, the way his jaw tightened like he'd been struck. Behind him, a monitor showed the feed. General Ryder's voice was reaching every major news station in Houston simultaneously, Houston's morning audience watching in real time. "I'm the patient whose life Major Sarah Chen saved last night," the general continued, his voice steady and precise. "And 3 hours before that, she saved my life in Ramadi when she was a major in the military. Both times, she disobeyed protocol. Both times, it was the right choice. Caldwell tried to speak. His mouth opened. No words came. I'm also calling to inform the Houston Police Department, the DEA, and the FBI that I have evidence Dr. Caldwell has been systematically stealing and diverting chemotherapy medications from Seattle General's pharmacy for black market sale. Major Chen witnessed this theft. She documented the medication vials being swapped 2 weeks ago. You've been trying to destroy her credibility because you knew she was going to expose you. You delayed response to my code this morning hoping I would die. That would have eliminated a witness, eliminated the general who might ask questions about why those drugs were missing. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old bone. Sweat traced a line down his temple. His hand reached for the podium to steady himself. The camera didn't miss a frame. Hospital security is currently reviewing surveillance footage, General Ryder's voice continued, relentless. The DEA has been notified. The FBI is en route to execute a search warrant on your residence and your vehicle. You destroyed a decorated officer's career to cover your crimes. You orchestrated her isolation. You tried to have her removed from this hospital before she could speak. And you failed. The feed cut. 2 federal agents entered the media room from the side exit, credentials already displayed, bodies moving with the efficiency of professionals who'd conducted this operation hundreds of times. Caldwell didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply stood there as they read him his rights, as they placed restraints on the wrists that had once signed orders, as they guided him out of the media room while the camera lights were still hot. The silence that followed was absolute. The producer looked at the camera. The producer looked at the empty podium. The producer made the call to cut the feed, but it was already too late. Every news station in Houston was looping the footage, the general's voice, Caldwell's face, the moment when a hospital administrator's life compressed into a single morning. 6 months later, the morning shift at Seattle General began like any other day, staff arriving before sunrise, charts pulled, medications prepped. The trauma bay gleamed under new LED panels, equipment arranged with military precision. On the 4th floor, in a corner office overlooking the emergency department, Major Sarah Chen sat at a desk with her Air Force dress blues hanging from a wooden stand behind her. The fabric was sharp enough to cut. Dress blues meant formal authority, meant rank, meant a return to something she'd thought she'd left behind forever. Her title read, Director of Emergency Medicine. The general's dog tag hung on her wall beside her silver star. She'd had the chain professionally repaired, the brake sealed with silver that caught the light like water. She looked at them every morning the way a sailor looks at a compass. Some chains break. Some breaks make you stronger. Some wounds, if you survive them, become your greatest strength. At 0700 hours, a figure appeared at the security desk downstairs. Dr. Caldwell, sitting behind a badge scanner in the night security uniform of someone serving community service as part of his sentencing. His medical license hung in a museum of shame, stripped, revoked, his name entered into every medical board database as a cautionary tale. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was irrefutable: 23 counts of drug diversion, 4 counts of patient endangerment, 5 counts of obstruction of justice. He'd been sentenced to 36 months in federal prison, pending appeal. Seattle General, however, had a different punishment in mind. Community service. 2 years working the security desk, watching people he used to command walk past him in the morning. Watching them succeed. Watching them save lives. Major Chen arrived at 0700, exactly on schedule. Her boots made a crisp sound against the tile, not the tentative steps of a nurse worried about her job, but the measured stride of someone returning to her station. Caldwell's hand shook as he scanned her badge. She paused at his desk, and in that moment, he thought she might speak, might say something cruel, something he deserved. Instead, she simply set down a coffee cup. Black, no sugar, the way she'd been drinking it since she was 23 years old in Ramadi. "You taught me something important, Dr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice had changed since the night she'd saved his life. It carried authority now, the weight of command, the tone of someone who'd been given back what was stolen. Power isn't a title. Power is the ability to help. She walked past him without waiting for a response. Upstairs, the trauma bay was already moving, nurses prepping, residents reviewing charts, the machinery of saving lives spinning into motion. Sarah moved through it like a general reviewing her troops, which, in a sense, she was. The break room that once emptied when she entered now filled when she arrived for rounds. The unit board where Caldwell had once humiliated her displayed commendations, accolades, a citation from the Joint Commission for Excellence in Emergency Medicine. General Ryder attended his final cardiac rehabilitation session that morning, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes at his side, their voices carrying the cadence of warriors who'd found their way home. The tremor in Sarah's left hand was still there, would always be there, carried forward from shrapnel and sacrifice and the cost of doing what was right when it would have been easier to obey. But now everyone who saw it understood that tremor was a decoration. It was evidence. It was proof that she'd bled, that she'd served, that she'd earned the right to stand where she stood and make the choices only she could make. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, would you have saved him the second time, or walked away? Because Major Sarah Chen didn't hesitate. She never does.